We got to bring on our next panelist because we're already over. So I'm going to bring all three of them on right away. We have Chad Young, Eric Dadmun, and Hunter Denson. We're going to be talking about fantasy baseball auction strategies. I'm going to let you guys introduce yourselves, but this is going to be a fantastic panel because I know a lot of people do normal snake drafts and they don't really know exactly what they should be doing inside of your auction leagues. Well, these three guys are here to help. So thanks so much for being here, and I'll take it away.
All right, thanks, Nick. And yeah, if you're doing your normal snake drafts, you're missing out because we're going to talk a lot today about why, not just what you should do in auctions, but why auctions are better. There's so much coverage of snake drafts out there. There's rankings and people talk strategies, but there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on with auctions, and you should be getting on board. And so that's what we're here to talk about today. My name's Chad Young. I write Going Deep articles for Pitcher List. You can also find my work over at Rotographs. My Twitter feed is right there at Chad Young. I'm also on a couple podcasts, the Autobot podcast that focuses on auto new leagues, and Keeper Cut, one of the new Pitcher List podcasts focused on keeper leagues and sort of the long-term view of leagues. Eric, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hey, I'm Eric Dadmun. I write on Pitcher List as well, mainly working on the bullpen team. So during the year, I'll mainly be doing stuff surrounding that bullpen depth chart. So finding the next Devin Williams earlier than everybody else. And then, whenever I get another, my mind goes down another rabbit hole, like I wrote a piece on the Reds pitching system this offseason. So just kind of random things here and there, but all on Pitcher List.
All right, and Hunter, what about you?
Sure. Hey, everybody. My name is Hunter. I write for a Pitcher List, mostly on the Dynasty side, so I contribute to some of the top 50 lists and other articles there occasionally, but also some of the team previews and occasionally a Going Deep piece every now and then. So those are the areas I like to stick in, but really excited to chat more about auction strategy today.
Yeah, so let's jump right in with you guys are both told me that you primarily play in auction leagues at this point, maybe only play in auction leagues at this point. What is it about auctions? Why do you prefer them? What do you like so much about them?
Yeah, I can start off. I really just like that you have so much more control. Like, I feel like when you're in a snake draft, you have your spot and that's just what it's going to be, right? You have no chance to get certain players. And so I like the fact that you can constantly adjust. You may get some really good values that you would have never, thought that you're going to reach. So I just like how dynamic it is. And I like that you have to constantly pay attention, right? You have to really think about that strategy. You have to be agile and flex, whenever needed as things kind of adjust during that process. So those are the big things that stick out to me.
Yeah, dynamic is the word there. You have to be engaged on every single pick or else value is going to slip by you. It really rewards you for doing your homework as a baseball manager. I also think it's generally more equitable. Like, I think there's a consensus that the top 5 picks are the best 5 this year. You have those first 5 hitters that everybody wants to get. And then for me, at least, there's a bit of a drop off. So like if I'm in a snake league, I want to be either top 5 or around the turn. But with auctions, you don't need to worry about that. Everybody's on the same even playing field. You get $260 a piece. And if you don't get Acuna, it's because you didn't want him bad enough.
Yeah, for sure. And I think one of the fun things is if you look at that and you go, you know what, those first 5 guys, they're too expensive for me. You can suddenly grab 3 second-round picks instead of being stuck with whatever you're left with, right? You have the ability to adjust. And I agree. I think there are so many more strategies and nuances and things you can adjust to. What do you think is the biggest difference versus a snake draft? What's the single thing that stands out to you as just like, this is so dramatically different from the other style?
I'll go first. This one we'll kind of switch back and forth there. So I think I mentioned the engagement. I think that's a really big adjustment to make. Like, even if you buy an Acuna and you spend a ton of money, you got to be ready, mentally like engaged the very next pick, willing to get more value there. There's no time off until you're out of a particular position. Like once you get your catcher or 2, you're probably out when you're talking about catchers. But you don't get that time to retreat back into analysis mode almost. When you get a snake draft, you can have those programs where you'll put in the player and it says, oh, you're weak in this, you're strong in this. And you have a couple of minutes, maybe even 15 minutes, depending on how long your clock is, to reevaluate. Everything's on the fly in auction.
So how do you, before we go to Hunter, Eric, how do you handle that, right? I mean, you're right. In a draft, I make my pick. I then can sit back, especially if I'm not like at the turn or something, right? I got some time. I wait. I look. I figure out, oh, and this is what I need next. Here's who's coming up. Here's what ADPs look like. In an auction, when you don't have that, how do you adjust for that?
Well, you have to have, I think, tiers and budgets per position, and we'll talk more about like the prep that I do a little bit later. But I think tiers do a really good job at helping you not overspend in one area or one position, and then that positional budget as well helps you get an idea of when you really want to focus on those top tier guys, and when you have several like deeper guys that maybe you really like several pitchers who are like in snake drafts would be below 200 ADP. That might tell you that you don't really need to target those really top tier pitchers, and you want to give that money towards top outfielders or a top tier second baseman. So that prep really helps you with that.
Sounds good. So Hunter, what about you? What do you think is the biggest difference between a snake draft and an auction?
Yeah, and I echo some of what Eric said. Like the preparation is so key because you just don't have the ability to take a moment, go look. You have to really make the decision there. I think it just adds a couple other wrinkles. One, when you're in just a regular draft, you kind of have an idea of when somebody's going to go. You can kind of plan for it, and there's a point where, okay, I might need to jump in this position or this player because like this is it. But with the auction draft, this could happen at any point. You could be bidding on somebody else, and all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, I have to have this not a catcher, but any other position as you kind of go through there. And so I think like being able to make good decisions and not jump in like you do in a snake draft when you're like, everyone's taking a pitcher, I need to have an arm, let's grab this arm, or this guy's up to 40, I'm going to do it, let's jump to 45 and just go. I think that it puts so much more pressure on you, and there's a much bigger fear of missing out in the auction, because as the bids start to go up and you start to think, no, I really want this guy, I'm selling myself on him, I have to go further, and then you bid sometimes and you're like, I just blew like a third of my budget. What am I going to do for the rest of this? So I just think that's the biggest difference is, yeah, the preparation, you got to have it and all that, but you've got to really keep your mind set on what you want to do, because it's so easy to buy into the narrative of what is going on in that instant, and it can completely derail you if you're not ready for it.
Yeah, I think it's one of the big great things about an auction, and one of the more difficult things about an auction is if you get your heart set on somebody, in an auction, you can go get them, right? There's nobody nobody can take a guy in the second round that you're dead set on in the third. That doesn't happen in an auction. You can go bid. On the other hand, if you're dead set on a guy, you might end up going and getting them. And that's not always the right thing to do as those prices start to go up. And those prices are obviously crucial here, right? So when you're prepping for a draft, you're using rankings. There are tiers, which obviously helps. In an auction, you need some sort of dollar values, right? It's not enough to be like, oh, this guy's the third best second baseman. You have to know he's worth in $20, $30, $15, whatever it is. Starting with you, Hunter, where do you go get those dollar values?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there's a variety of places that I've gotten them over the years. Fangraphs has a great tool. I have sometimes even just pulled up just generic rankings based on whatever the scoring system is. It has some dollar values just because it gives me a set thing to work with, and then I can just adjust them as I want based on tier as I go through. So I usually try to start with at least something that's already created, and then I just put my own flourish as I figure out, all right, my tiers, the values, and then usually like a little bit of variance in there on like, this is where I want to get them, but I'm willing to go up to this, like just in a unique situation where I think like I need to have this and I need to move on. So typically it's what I do. I think the biggest piece for me with putting the dollar rankings is really going through first and thinking about who you really want, and then who you will be okay getting in case they drop to the price. And I think that can help undercut some of that FOMO that'll happen in the auction when you come in. But that's typically what I do, is just try to get a baseline, and then I'll go through and put it out based on kind of what I feel. And then once I get into the draft, I try to keep notes on who's going for what at position at the bigger players, so I can kind of have an idea.
What does that tell you when you keep those notes? What are you looking for when you're like, oh, okay, let's use outfield, right? Trout went for this, Acuna went for this, Soto went for that. What does that tell you as the draft goes on?
Yeah, I think it tells me when to jump in on some of the higher tier players, because I'm one of the people at the beginning, it's like, I don't want to throw $50 on Fernando Tatis or whoever it happens to be. So when we start to go in on outfield specifically, I'm looking to see like, where do I think I can get Yelich compared to what they're going for the top ones, because I think he might bounce back. So I look at people that I would still consider high-end players, but have something that's holding them back, a little bit in people's minds, so that I can say, all right, I don't want to go broke, but this level right here, based on what I'm seeing there, if I can get under this, like this range, I'm going to jump on that. So,
got it. Eric, what about you? Where do you get those values?
Yeah, before I say that, so Hunter made a good point about like using bids and using how previous auctions went. Sorry about that. Using how previous auctions went to learn about what your other opponents are looking for. That's so huge. But in terms of getting auction values, Hunter mentioned the Fangraphs auction calculator. That's generally where I start. I start with that with my league settings put in. I put in my preferred projection system, which the past couple of years has been ATC. And then that's where I get my base values. And like Hunter said, I go in and just do different flourishes. I have these guys that I like as I listen to podcasts, as I look through the data. I have these guys that I like. And most of the time, the adjustments that I make are fairly non-scientific. It's not like I'm saying, oh, I think he's going to have a home run to fly ball rate of approximately 2% higher. And therefore, it's fairly unscientific from there. But it's just designed to help me get the players that I like, because that's the point of the auction, right? You want to buy the players that you like. So yeah, I'll go through and adjust values based on what I want to see. And I end up adjusting pitchers quite a bit more than hitters. These projection systems are generally quite a bit more accurate with hitters than with pitchers. So I generally try not to second guess the hitters too much, except when it comes to like plate appearances, if I feel like I know something that the projection system doesn't.
Just in terms of playing time, this guy you don't think is going to play as much as they think, or will play more than the projection thinks?
Yeah, basically, if there's either more recent information, more recent news or signing that came out that I think the projection system isn't taking into account yet, or if I feel like there's considerably more risk of not having a player not getting particular amount of playing time, then I might adjust plate appearances.
Got it. And so now, for both of you, once you get those values, how hard and fast are you on those values, right? You say, I've got Tatis, he is a $37 shortstop. That's, the auction calculator spit something out. I then went and made an adjustment to it. That's the number I'm putting on him. What happens if he gets to 38? Do you go for it? I mean, are there times where you go for it, or do you just stick with those values? And Hunter, let's start with you.
It's a good question. I tend to stick pretty close to my values, but Eric, I'm glad you mentioned that you're not super scientific sometimes in some of the things you'll do, because there are times when I'll look and say, okay, for a player like that, if they're within $3 of what I think, then I could be tempted to jump on it. But at the beginning, I'm really close to what I think, because I want to make sure that I have good money throughout, especially as we start to get towards the back end to really fill in. So typically for the first, I would say 10 or so players, I'm a little more reticent to jump on it. But if someone is within 3 and they're a high end guy for me, I'm probably going to pull the trigger on at least one of them.
Interesting. I'm kind of the opposite here. I'm more likely to overspend a couple of dollars early on a player that I really like, because I trust myself. Even if I'm down to like 4 players and I've got $4 left, I trust myself there. I do a lot of research. I know guys who, typically the guys who are above 300 ADP in a snake draft that are lottery tickets that I wouldn't mind having. And in a snake draft, like those last 4 picks that you have, how often do they stay on your roster the whole year round? So I don't mind going over a little bit early, even if it means me running out of money a little bit before I'm done, just because I recognize that there's a certain amount of volatility, and who knows who's going to break out in those first couple of weeks, that I'm going to want to drop that guy that I spent $4 on and just go with a hot hand. So I'll break the bank a little bit, right? I'm not going to go 15% higher than what I planned, but a few dollars here and there, I'll do it.
Are there certain types of players you're more willing to go over on?
Yeah, I am not really willing to go over on relievers. I'm not really willing to go over on catchers. I'm not like this year, I'm not going to be willing to go over on third baseman. With third baseman, there's just too much depth there. I like a lot of the guys going later.
I think it's a great call.
Yeah. And with relievers, there's just too much volatility. I'm not going to go over for them. And with catchers, you never know who's going to break out. There's just such a low bar to be a relevant fantasy catcher. You had Roberto Perez come out in 2019 and just was all of a sudden a top 10 fantasy catcher for most of the year, and then just fades away. You had Pedro Severino for the first half of 2020, and that was just great. Catchers are just so volatile because there's such that low bar. So with those kinds of positions, I'm definitely not willing to go over. With other people, with other players, I generally would be.
Yeah, and I would follow up and say for me, catchers don't exist. I typically will just completely like hide that level on my Excel sheet of my roster until I get into the bitter end of it because it's just a total lottery and it doesn't matter. But I would echo on relievers. That's the hardest piece for me because I just hate investing in something that is just such a big chance of busting. But I think the areas I'm more willing to go big on and jump up a little bit when you get into that, like I would say 18 to 26 range of ranking player, I'm willing to go up a bit to land two really good players in that range and then kind of go forward there. Right or wrong, pitchers for me, I'm not super willing to jump up a lot, especially at the higher end. I feel like you can always get good pitchers later. And this year, given some of the news we've gotten on the ball changes and just how last year went, I still think that there's going to be a lot of good pitching available, not at the top. I could be wrong. My teams may be terrible this year, but that's the way I look at it. So.
Yeah, I agree with starting pitchers this year. I think there's going to be a lot of depth. We're going to see we're not going to see that many 200 inning guys this year. We're going to see so many guys who are in and out of the rotation. Think with the Brewers saying that they're only going to add 100 innings. Think guys like the Reds, Michael Lorenzen, who's if he was a 160 inning pitcher, I'd be all over him, but I think he's going to give 120. But then that means generally we'll overvalue the person that wins the job first and undervalue the person that is going to take over later, right? So the guy overvalued right now, although I wouldn't say he's overvalued, he's still the target of mine, Michael Lorenzen, but people forget how good TJ Antone was for his 20-some innings last year. People do the same thing with closers. You'll overvalue Nick Anderson. And then last year, people just forgot about Diego Castillo, not remembering that he was always going to get like 30% of the saves. That was always going to happen. So, yeah, we don't want to forget about the next man up.
Mm-hmm. And I would say too with pitchers, like given the lower innings numbers and all that, you're going to have more people that'll get pieces of the pie just in innings in general. So like you need to have this. This is why you need to do so much research. Is you need to know who else you want to go for to fill in those gaps where you're going to have the Milwaukee pitchers who aren't going as hard or others, like where you need to fill that in. And so I think that's just key because there's always good innings to be had, even if it's not the high name or whatever that you want to see on your roster.
Makes sense. So other than getting these values together, right? You get those values together. What other prep do you do for an auction, particularly stuff that might be different than what you would do for a snake draft? Eric, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and go first on this one. So for keeper leagues, there's a whole mess of keeper specific prep that needs to happen. And we can expand on this later, but things like calculating keeper inflation, things like making sure you know how much money the other teams have, what positions they're going to be looking for, all of that keeper specific. It deserves its own answer, its own kind of side of
we will get
the
to
discussion.
That for sure.
Yeah. So outside of the keeper specific prep, I mentioned making tiers. I mentioned making positional budgets. And one thing I want to say about those position budgets is that they never happen that way. It never ends up going according to your plan. But you make them anyway because, like I said, it gives you an idea of what positions you want to go hard early on, like in the top half of the player pool, and what positions you want to wait on. Whether or not it actually ends up happening that way is one, it's a different story. But you want to do that prep so that you have an idea of about what your spending distribution is going to be. And then if there's anything like, if there are any other, if there are any fans of particular teams in there, you might want to know that. And then nomination strategies too. I think through nomination strategies a little bit. Those are fun.
Mm-hmm.
What about you, Hunter?
Yeah, I mean, nomination strategy for sure. I think one thing I try to think on is, when coming into an auction draft, looking at a player, like I mentioned before, that has something going on with them that is causing people to discount them a bit, but they could be a monster. And if you really think they're going to jump out, I look at somebody like Yordan Alvarez, is thinking, all right, this is the amount of money I want to spend on this spot, but can I get this person in a handcuff or somebody that could come in and step in case they miss time for this total price that I want? And I think that's good because if you look at what Alvarez is projected to do, even if you take that down a bit, if you can find a solid backup bat that can step in, you still get overall great production, maybe close to the level you would expect if he's fully healthy. So I think that's something different I do coming in. And then, yeah, I mean, most of the rest of it is similar. You need to know what the most up-to-date news is. You need to see like what things are changing as you go in. But that's the biggest one for me is I do look at handcuff situations to see if I could potentially get both players in a really key spot for that price that I want to spend.
Yeah, it's another advantage.
Yeah,
it's another advantage of the auction strategy, right? Is that you can buy that guy early, and when his handcuff comes up for nomination, if you want him, you can go get him. You're not stuck hoping that somebody else doesn't jump in early and grab him.
Yeah, and I've sometimes done it the other way where I've been on the handcuff first, like especially for a hitter if I know that's what I want to do, because then I've got who I want. So then I can maybe go a little more on the other if I already feel good about the backup I have there.
Interesting. Like, did you nominate the handcuff first? Like, did you try to slide him in under the radar, or?
Typically, if I'm looking at that, it's somebody I feel like that gets undervalued because they're just boring and like they give good stats, but people aren't going to like go out of the way to get them. So usually after the first kind of bidding frenzies are going on, I'll try to slide somebody in like that to see if I can get a good deal. But I typically have at least a couple that I could consider, and if that doesn't work, it could adjust how I go when I look at that one big player I wanted. I may still go for it, may not.
Interesting. Yeah, I definitely look at relievers for handcuffs quite a bit because with handcuffs, depending on your league settings, some league settings really don't put much value on setup. But even if you're just in a 5x5, setup men have some value. Like worst case scenario, if he never gets any saves, you just get a saving, like a ratios anchor with a bunch of strikeouts. Devin Williams was what, like a top 75 pitcher last year, not even getting any saves. Obviously that's an extreme situation, but setup men, they don't get enough play, I think, in typical leagues.
Yeah.
So when you talked about positional budgets, do you go in with a set hitter pitcher split? Are you're going to spend 65%, 70% on hitters and the rest on pitchers, or are you more fluid than that?
It's a little fluid, but I don't ever want to get to the point where I'm like even 55% hitters. I always want to be 60% to 70% hitters, I think. Like your typical roster is what, 23, like 14 hitters, 9 pitchers. And so that's like just about 60-40 right there, right? So if you're spending evenly on hitters and pitchers, you'll get 60-40. But we mentioned how projections are so much more accurate with hitters. It's because hitters are just less volatile, right? So I typically want to spend more on bats. And so like my typical target is like 65-35, but I don't hold myself to that. Like I said, at a certain point, it gets a little non-scientific.
And I'm pretty similar. I love bats. Pitchers, I was one, but they're all over the place. So it's kind of hard with that. But I think some of it depends on what goes on in the auction. If there's a stud that is going lower for some reason, if pitchers start to get a little discount, then I might jump in and go for it. I'm perfectly comfortable getting up to even like a 75-80% on hitters because, again, there's a lot of good arms. You can always fill in. And I think, too, it can be a little risky, but even looking at some of the Ian Andersons, like people like that are still, they may be really good. We think they will be, but they're younger. We don't know what they're going to go on. I think that you can get some people like that sometimes at certain points of the draft for good value to fill in. But yeah, I mean, I'm mostly looking at hitters. I will say that unless there's something crazy going on with the pitcher values.
Now, you guys have both mentioned having types of players you're looking for. When you go into an auction, do you have specific names you're targeting? Do you have guys that you're like, this player, right? You mentioned Yordan Alvarez before. Like, are you like, I'm going to have him on my team. I based on the price I think he's going to go for, based on where I think he's going to be, he's my guy. I'm targeting him. Do you have guys like that going into an auction?
Yes and no. There are people that are on that list for me, but again, with the auction area, I am much more willing to say, no, that's too much for me. This guy gets similar stats. I'm going to go with that. So there's very few people that I will just shoot the moon on. Christian Yelich is one that I would probably go a little bit. Bo Bichette is interesting, but most of the people, even Alvarez, who I really like, I actually was in an auction draft last night, and he got to a point where I was like, no. I was like, I just can't do it. It's probably fine, but I'm going to go a different way. So.
Yeah, I think just like on the opposite side, there are a few players that I'm absolutely out on. There are very, very few players that I would say I need to walk away with this guy. I think that's how you bait yourself into overpays. You have to be willing to walk away and recognize that, all right, if I get somebody to overpay now, that's profit later for me that I'm going to be able to pocket. You have to, as tough it is as it is, you have to be willing to kill your darling sometimes.
And that's why a lot of times in fantasy, I've just had a rule for myself that I don't draft people from my favorite team, or even an auction, unless they're reaching like a ridiculous point on price. I'm just going to be like, let's just take that out of the equation. Unless I just am seeing a good deal here, I'm just going to let that go.
Just to avoid that hometown bias. And
sometimes you got to do it. You know yourself, your blind spots. Sometimes you just have to take that off the table,
Yeah.
I get too attached to players, but it's usually not the players. I'm a Cleveland fan. I have lots of Cleveland players I love, but I get attached to guys on other teams that I'm just like, I'm going to go get, like this year I am just super in on Nick Castellanos, and I'm going after him in every league I'm playing in. I did actually recently have an auction where the price just pushed too high, and I finally backed off and ended up pivoting to a Kyle Schwarber for about $6-7 less. And I was like, hey, that's totally fine. But I think it's a good example of the kind of thing you're talking about, Hunter, where it's like, I got this guy. I think he's going to be a good price. He's a guy I'm targeting. But the way that auction went, it just didn't make sense. And I had to pivot and do something else. And it's one of the fun things about the auction is you get the ability to make those kinds of changes.
Yeah, exactly. Like I definitely have guys where my ears perk up. Those guys that I mentioned where I adjust their value. When I do that, I'll kind of notice that, I'm kind of the high guy on this particular player versus the rest of the projections. And I'll know that in a majority of my drafts, I'm going to end up with this player just because I'm the high guy on it. But it's important. It's probably even more important on those particular guys to set just a max value that, all right, even though I like this guy, I cannot go above this value.
Yeah, and I think one thing that hurts me too, we all want values, right? We look for buy low players that we're much higher on than other people. Auction is tough because you have to know when to jump in to get a good deal. And I feel like I get sold on these people that I'm like, this guy is going to erupt. I'm going to look like a genius. And then I end up spending more to the point where I'm like, this wasn't even a bargain. I could have better allocated these dollars, but it's like you just get into that mindset. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So we mentioned before, Dynasty, Keeper, different formats have a little bit of a different structure. Let's talk a little bit about that in a Keeper format, anywhere where a bunch of the pool is off the table before you even get started. How does that change your prep? And Hunter, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, one thing is obviously like looking at needs, like where do I have needs, all of that. But for me, even coming into that, I'm going to go value probably overall. I like to trade. There's always good ways to pick up what you need from other spots. So I likely coming in, I'm just going to see like what's the best value here, especially if it's a keeper league, is if I'm thinking that there's something that stands out. But that's going to be the biggest thing for me is where's the biggest value, and then do I think I either need to target what I need for my team, or can I just turn that into something else a little bit later on? Like having patience and not coming out of the draft feeling like you have a fully formed roster is one of the biggest things that I try to remember in the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, keeper leagues, they allow you to know a lot more about what your opponents have and what they're looking for. So there's a considerable amount more prep that needs to be done. Like ideally, you'd know how much money they have, what they'd probably be spending on pitchers versus hitters, what targets, what targets they might have based on their potential, their keepers that they have. That's going out there a little bit. But the other really, really important thing to do is keeper league inflation. You have to calculate your inflation rate. So because there's a limited amount of value and then there's a limited amount of money. So your league might be inflated, 20 to 30%. If somebody's able to keep Juan Soto for $6, that makes you pay a little bit more for everybody else. So the amount of profit that's already out there will affect how much you have to spend to get somebody in free agency, for example. And it can be a lot if you go into a keeper league, like an established keeper league with a redraft set of auction values. You're potentially gonna walk away with peanuts and a bunch of money in your pocket.
Yeah, I think that inflation is a really important piece of this. And for those who are new to auctions or new to keeper leagues with auctions, the way that basically plays out is at the start of a new draft, if you've got $3,000 across the 12 teams to spend, there's $3,000 worth of value to be drafted in that auction. If you've got keepers and those keepers cost $1,000 but provide $1,500 in production,
Mm-hmm.
that means there's now only $1,500 of production left to be bought, but $2,000 to spend on it. And so everyone's prices go up as a result. It's a really important thing. It's, I think, especially for people, like I said, if you're new to a league, if you jump into a league that's been going for a long time and you're new to it, you could get thrown off pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Anything you've noticed with inflation where it's like, are there situations where inflation is particularly problematic, players who it's particularly problematic with? Do you see any sort of, or is it just sort of like, hey, everyone's going to be 30% more expensive than I thought?
Gosh, it can really vary. To me, sometimes I feel like the weirder thing is I tend to see some of the people that are a bit more of a lock to provide something can start going for a lot more than you would have expected, compared to the others. So sometimes I know that I've come in and said, okay, I'm going to go maybe for this tier because I feel like I'll be able to get them for a better price. And then the prices are still just exorbitant. I think the big thing is just you have to just keep in mind that things can get crazy and not settle yourself where you want to be. Because again, that's when, Eric, you'll leave and just have money and you didn't spend it because you're unwilling to go out. Like, you need to have a good idea of what you want. And again, remember, like you're just saying, Chad, the value they're going to produce and making sure that it overcomes that price. So that's the weird thing I've seen sometimes is just more baseline people just start to get a little insane because people are like, I need a sure thing and I want to invest my money. That's what I'm going to do. So
Yeah, I think that can happen with some of the top line players too. Like if you've got a strong set of keepers, let's say a team has a really strong set of hitters, and on good contracts, and they just say, I want to spend a bunch of money on a couple of pitchers. They might just be able to say, I'm taking Jacob deGrom, and you cannot stop me because I have that much more buying power. And they can do that. And it might be worth it too. Like I've got my one of my keeper leagues, the spreadsheet up here, just to give you an idea of the rates you might be looking at. So based on the ATC projections, it says Jacob deGrom is worth 50. That it'd be hard pressed to get that in a redraft league, but he might get there. In a keeper league with all of these keepers kept, he's 70. Right. So that's how it's just a factor of the amount of profit that is kept out there. And it goes to show how much you might have to spend if you need to go out and get one of those top name guys in free agency, just because somebody else might be walking into the draft with, I don't know, if it's 10 keepers, they might be walking into the draft with $75 a profit, just.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point that you have to know your opponents a little bit more in an auction, especially in a keeper auction, than you do in a draft. I find that you gave that example of somebody just saying, hey, I'm going to go get deGrom. And I'm going to age myself a little bit because it was years ago, but I went into a draft years ago where my offense was super strong. I needed pitching at the top. And I just was like, Tim Lincecum and Clayton Kershaw are going to be my guys. They were the top two pitchers that were available in the auction, and I was just going to pay for them. And if I had to go up to $70-$80 on them, I was just going to do it because I had the money to do it, and that was what I needed. I don't know how much other people in my league spent time looking at my roster and realizing the situation I was in, but it would have been real easy for someone else to be like, you know what? First of all, I can price enforce Chad forever. But second of all, I'm not going to get those guys. And so I have to come up with a different strategy. And so it's one of those things I think is really important in those auctions, especially those keepers, is what do other people need? Does everybody need a shortstop or does nobody need a shortstop? And thinking about how that impacts your prices, I think can have a really big impact in what you do. So
yeah, sorry, but just going on to price enforcing, that's really important. Like sometimes there have been situations where I've been out on a particular position, but then I realize this guy's going for way cheaper than he really should. And I know he will pay more than he's currently paying. Sometimes I have the guts to go in and just make him bump up that bid a couple of dollars. Sometimes I don't, because it's risky. You don't want to get left holding the bag for a player you don't want. But sometimes if you're confident enough and if you're willing to take a couple of risks, you might do it.
Yeah, I mean, do you find, Hunter, that you price enforce, or do you just sort of, if this guy's a value, I'll bid on him, and if he's not, I won't?
Oh, I love to do that. If I feel pretty good, like if I know who's in my league and I feel pretty good about it, I'll do it. There's nothing that feels better than making somebody pay more for somebody that they really want or need when you can get it up, especially when you start to get to that point where at the beginning they might, you bid them up, they'll do it like a few dollars more, and then you start to get into those one battles, where they're like, I need this guy, but do I want this? I love that. There's nothing that drives me more. It's great.
Oh, you can nickel and dime them to death. Yes.
So you guys have maybe more risk tolerance than I do, because I look at that and I'm always like, what if they don't bid? What if I get stuck with this guy? And
Yeah.
I always end up backing off of those. I never feel like I can price enforce effectively.
Some of it depends on the player. Like there are just certain profiles that I don't like, and I would be like, man, if I got this guy, what in the world would I do? But I feel like just like the fear of missing out I talked about, sometimes in that situation, I just want to do it. And I'm going to do this. It's going to be fine because you can always get value for that player. Otherwise it'll work out.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I wouldn't price enforce for a player I wouldn't at least be happy to have.
Yeah.
I'm not going to price enforce for a Teoscar Hernandez or a Keston Hura. Not going to do it. But for a Bo Bichette, a guy with a lot of hype, who I wouldn't mind having, I'll price enforce. At the worst comes to worst, I overspend by $5-7 on a guy that I think is really good. So.
Yeah, I think a lot of this comes down to knowing yourself and knowing what you're going to want to do after the auction. I know, Hunter, you talked about you don't mind coming out of the auction with an incomplete team. That makes a lot of sense if you're somebody who likes to trade, is active in the trade market. You know that you're in a league where trades are going to happen. How much does knowing your league and knowing yourself maybe change your auction strategy? I mean, if someone's not as comfortable trading, do they have to come in with a different strategy?
I think you have to consider it. I love to trade. I mean, it's a big thing that I like to do. And especially in leagues where salary is involved, I've gotten into situations that I have a lot of owners that are like, oh, I don't feel comfortable with that. I'm like, look, I'll figure it out. It's going to work out one way or the other. So I think if you need to look at your risk profile and see what you're okay with. And that's got to go forward, because if you went with my approach and you don't feel good about that, and you're not going to really beat down the door to figure out who's going to trade with you, like it's going to end up just being a lost year, basically. So.
Yeah, and I think it's important to know what in general your league values. So if your league values those young prospects who you can keep at the minimum bid and keep them for several years, then maybe there's some arbitrage to be had there. By going after a veteran player who's established, who is like at the value they probably should be. There might be some profit. There might be some profit there. Like if you can keep them at the value that they probably should be. Remember, keeper league inflation, right? You're making money there. So there may be some arbitrage opportunities depending on what your league is valuing and what your league isn't.
Yeah.
So we've started to get into a little bit of price enforcing and what you do during an auction. Let's talk about nominating strategy, right? So one of the things that's really different, right? In a snake draft, your turn comes up, you just pick a guy you want, right? You take the guy at the top of the board. Maybe you move around a little bit based on ADPs and what you think might happen the next round. But in general, you're just taking the guy you want with that pick. That's not necessarily how it works when you nominate, right? So Eric, what's your nominating strategy?
Oh, nominations are so fun. They're so fun. It's your chance to get in the minds of your opponents. It's your chance to play mind games with them. So early on, I'm just trying to learn about the market. I'm generally the first thing I'm gonna try and look at is, all right, are we buying into hyped up players, or are we really gonna value those established older players? So a guy this year who I might look at is Bo Bichette. We mentioned him a couple of times already. If I notice Bo Bichette goes for something close to what I expected, like Francisco Lindor to go for, I'm like, all right, we're buying into the hype of like the projections of 2021. I might be able to snag some deals on, I don't know, a Patrick Corbin or a Javi Baez, guys who underperformed in 2020, but who have a long track record of success. If I find that, Bichette's going below where I thought he would, I might snag him. And then B, I know that, okay, I can maybe take advantage and maybe get you to overbid on some of those, older established guys that I think are showing like actual underlying signs of regression. So those early nominations are so key to learn about what your opponents are valuing in general.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think that's a good way to look at everything there. Something I try to do, I have a mix. I do at the beginning sometimes like to toss out some upper tier players that I am not as sold on to go ahead and get some money out of the way. But the other thing that I try to do, as I mentioned, I'm not a big catcher fan or reliever fan, is I will try to dominate those as well, just to go ahead and start to, first of all, get more data points so I can see where the market is on other areas, but to start to get some of that money flowing so we can really see it. I think for me, the difficulty is figuring out when to nominate like more of the lower mid-tier people that I kind of want to sneak in on, because I feel like at the beginning of a draft, people love to bid. So if you toss somebody up there, there's a decent chance that they're going to go for at least what they were supposed to, if not a little more. So I like to kind of, feel that out, toss one person who's a bargain that like would be fine if I got, but if I lost out, I can at least see a bit about what that type of player is going for, like you're mentioning. So it's a few things I would look at.
It makes sense. I think this is, for me, it's one of the areas where those tiers come in really important, because one of the things I'll do, if there's a wide tier, like for me this year, first base, there's a whole bunch of first basemen under Freddie Freeman who I still really like, who I'd be very happy to end up with. And that's a situation where I might try to sneak in someone from the middle bottom of that tier early on, in the hopes that everyone else in the auction's going, oh, but there's these 6 other guys that are all still out there, and I could get any of them. I don't need to overbid, Rhys Hoskins or Matt Olson or whoever it was I tossed out here. There's an opportunity to get a value there. And I think to your point, Hunter, if I lose out on that guy, well, there's those 6 other guys there, right? So if that guy goes for too much, one of those guys eventually has to be a discount. You would think, you hope, I guess. So early on, I mean, I think it sounds like you guys are using those early nominations to try to feel things out, get some money on the table, see how people are responding. How do you figure out? So I guess what is this? At some point, you have to then pivot and start nominating guys you want, right? Because you start to hit a point where you're like, I might nominate this guy for $1 and I might get stuck with him because nobody may bid. How do you know, or how do you figure out when you're going to switch that nomination strategy and start to just go for it?
I think that for me, it happens fairly early. I feel like once you start to get into the first 10 or 15 players that are nominated, I've got a good idea on some level of certain types of players that I'm going to go for. And I think I know where their price is going to be. So I'll start buying, but I typically buy a good bit at the beginning, and then I have breaks depending on what's coming through the pipeline there. So as far as nominating, I think one thing I try to do as well is just think about people who could give me production at a position that people aren't thinking about. So when you look at like a guy like Max Muncy or somebody who has multi-position eligibility, I try to find somebody who could be my first baseman or something else, but most people are looking at him as another one where I might get a value there because I can just slide him over and then go into another spot. So I usually bid a good bit at the beginning, take a break and see how things are laying out, and then I'm going to jump in where I see the value, whether that's maybe pitching is going lower. Maybe I can really jump in and grab some, middle infield, corner infield, just fill that out because there's more opportunity there. So.
Okay, I think I switch over a little bit later than you. I switch over when I have maybe half or so of my team filled out. In the early going, like we've already talked about what happened in the early going, and then in the middle, I start to feel out. All right, what is starting to get scarce? And if I'm out on that particular position, like second base is kind of scarce and there's kind of a steep drop off this year. So once I notice that if I get an early second baseman and I notice that there are still 4 people out there who want second baseman and there are only 2 left in the tier that I have, I'm going to throw one of them out there. I'm going to try and generate those bidding wars. Even into the middle of the draft, I'm still going to try and generate those overpays because those overpays are what's going to allow me with my last few nominations to get them at 1.
Interesting. And then what about your bidding strategy, right? So a guy goes up, do you try to make big jumps in bids for guys you're really excited about to scare people off? Do you try to go up $1 at a time to try to minimize what you pay? How do you think about sort of the actual bidding process? Eric, why don't you go first with this one?
Yeah, with bidding, I don't think a ton about bidding. Some people start every player at like $1, right? It typically gets pretty quickly to where it's supposed to be. I'll start just fairly like in the middle, like like my bargain, like the cheapest that I could possibly think that I could get him. I don't want to sell myself short. But from there, I'll kind of see how things are going. Often I'll nominate somebody and then sit back and then see how many other people I'm bidding against. And then that will kind of determine if I am aggressive in raising it $5, $10, or if I'm just trying to get one until I price the other guy out.
And is it you're going to be more aggressive if there's more people in there? Is that what you're saying? Like if 6 people are bidding, you're more likely to just say, let's jump $5 here and see if we can get some people out.
See if we can just like cause a lull, knock some people out. Yeah, probably.
See, for me, I feel like I'm the person everybody hates who's just going on the $1 bids, because I look at it as I don't want to pay any more than I have to for somebody. And I think at the beginning, like the first bid, you can totally throw out like a different number, right, if you have a good idea of their value. But, you know, with auction drafts, it's just so all over the place. And some people that you're like, there's no way this guy goes for this, and he does. So I would rather do that. And I kind of like having it, because at the beginning, when people start bidding, I'll usually do what you do. I'll bid, I'll sit back a little bit, because I feel like the more people that bid, you start to get into that frenzy where people want to buy in. And then I'm going to see, okay, where are we at? Do I want to keep going? But I've kind of found that the $1 thing, first of all, it can cause some people to bid more than they would, because when you just keep upping it by $1, they're like, no. And then they keep like getting into that fight with you. Yeah. But for me, it's just about, I want to make sure that whatever I get them at, if I feel good about it, that I'm spending the least amount to get them. So that's how I think about it.
Yeah, makes sense. And I'll see that point. It makes sense to, like put everybody and start everybody at $1. I think that makes sense now that I think a bit more about it, you know, especially those mid-range guys. You know, I really like John Means, but not everybody likes John Means, you know, so you may very well get John Means for $1, you know, depending on your league. So sure. Yeah, I'll see that point.
Yeah, and I think the debate about, you know, when does it make sense to jump $5 is an interesting one. Of when there's a lot of people in, you jump $5, somebody was probably going to go up $1 with you out of that group of 5 or 6 anyways. I totally agree with sitting back after I nominate or after a bid starts and just waiting. The risk there is you play, especially if you play with a lot of people who've done a lot of auctions, you can sometimes be in a league where there's like 8 people who their strategy is to sit back and wait to see what happens. And every once in a while, guys almost slip through if no one's paying attention. And so I agree with that, but I think sometimes I'll jump in and say, okay, let's at least get this moving, because you know, I sat back on Mike Trout and he's gone from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. And it's like, okay, let's just put in 25, at least get this moving. Otherwise, we're going to be here all day.
Yeah. Otherwise, it becomes like basketball at the end when there's like 40 seconds left, but it's going to take 3 hours because we're going to take all the timeouts and foul and everything.
Yep. Just takes forever. So we're getting close to the end here. We got about 10 minutes left. There's a couple last things I want to cover. You guys talked a lot in here about types of players you like and types of players you don't like. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit and ask you it specific. Is there anyone that you look at auctions this year and you think in auctions this guy or is a really good value or is generally a really bad value? Anyone you're really targeting or anyone you're really trying to stay away from?
Gosh, that's a good question. Yeah, I feel like go ahead, Derek. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just gonna say the same thing to buy myself a little bit of time. I haven't. I'm still like in the process of doing most of my draft prep, right? So I'm, in terms of who I think is going too high. I mean, Bauer is going like right there after Bieber and Cole, and I think there's a considerable amount more risk with Bauer than Bieber and Cole. That's that top end of the pitching, like so many pitchers at the top end. Bueller, how many innings is he going to get? Glass now, how many innings is he going to get? Is he going to, you know, the up and down, you know, with his, so many of those top end pitchers, I find myself wanting to just say, no, I'm gonna go with like a bunch of what do the Rays call it? A stable of studs, right? Just a stable of guys that I can just see. All right, who brings it all together this year? You know, so the top end pitchers are probably guys that I in general am staying out on.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. I think, you know, second base is an interesting area for me because I feel like you look at a guy like Ozzy Albies, and I have a lot of people I know who just, they're like, oh, I've got to have him. He's great. but gosh, I just have such questions about him. I don't know. I feel like he doesn't go for a crazy price a lot of the time, but I feel like there are better values in that pool that you can get later that would provide you similar, if not better. So I'm a little unsure as to why he's going like that. So that's somebody. Bauer for sure I just can't get behind that price. I don't know about it. And then when we look at the top players, and I know everyone's going to hate me for this, but I look at somebody like, if I'm looking at a top 5 type player that I want, Tatis is just really hard for me. Like, I just feel like there's a lot of good shortstops. I feel like I can blend it back, and so I feel like there's still enough volatility in my mind on him that I would be. I don't buy him at that price. Maybe a little bit lower, and so I know everyone's going to be like, "Slam Diego, I hate you," but that's the one I would just feel like I don't know about it. So
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think the depth at shortstop is stronger than it's been in a long time. I think for a lot of years, people got used to shortstop being this like there's like 6 of them, and if you don't get one of those 6, you got nobody. And now it doesn't feel that way anymore. And so I can totally see being like, you know what? It's only 143 games from Tatis. Let's let him, before we anoint him as the number one fantasy auction value, let's just slow down, let someone else have him. I'll take a lesser shortstop maybe for a better value. I totally get that. I'm with you guys on Bauer as well at the top. I feel like everyone I talk to is like, I don't know, that price on Bauer seems way too high, and yet he still keeps going for that price.
well, it's because you get to the point where you're like, well, Cole and Bieber are gone, and then you're like, I need to have a top tier arm, and so people are like, I've just got to go for it. Like, I've got to put the money in no matter what. So
Yeah, I've been backing off so far with him. I think the other thing this year that I'm finding is a really good opportunity for value is there are some established veterans, and I think Eric, you talked about this a little bit before, guys who have a good track record of success who 2020 wasn't very good. Nolan Arenado is a name that comes to mind for me. There's a bunch of top third basemen, and so people are tending to stay away from him because I think they can get a different top third baseman, which I totally get. But I think people are overreacting to him leaving Colorado. And I think people are overreacting to a 60-game 2020 season in which there were a million other things going on. And I think there's some opportunities with guys like that to get some value if you're willing to wait for them instead of jumping in and trying to go after a Jose Ramirez or a Anthony Rendon or someone like that.
yeah. And somebody else I would say too, I've been a little surprised at Carlos Carrasco compared to some of the other pitchers, because we talked Bauer and some others, but I feel like Carrasco doesn't get as much love, even though he pitched really well last year. And obviously there's some worries, but he provides great production. He's going to be in New York. I don't know. I feel like that's another one that I'm always surprised at where he goes, because there are riskier pitchers that get taken in the auction above him at a higher price. And I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah, actually, when Carrasco got traded, there was all this talk right away about like, oh, he's going to the NL. He's going to be in a better park for him. Like, this is going to be great for him. And I was like, all right, well, I'm going to be out on Carrasco because his price is clearly going up way too much. And then as things have started to sort of settle in and we're getting closer to auction season and more of these things are happening, I'm seeing more prices and I'm like, all right, if that's where he's going to slot in compared to some of these other guys, I'm coming back into Carlos Carrasco. And as I mentioned before, I'm a Cleveland fan, so I'm very familiar with Carrasco, and he's an excellent pitcher. He's also a super great guy. And I think, Eric, you mentioned earlier, one of the great things about auctions is like, you can just buy guys you like. You can build a team of players you want to cheer for, and you want, like, there is value in that. At least I think there's value in that from a fantasy perspective. Like, I want to win. I want to build a team of guys I like cheering for who are also better than your players. But it's one of the beauties of an auction is you can go out there and be like, you know what? I just like this guy. He's going to be my shortstop or my starting pitcher or my first baseman because I like him and I want him to have him on my team. So coming down to the last few minutes here, we've gone through a lot of stuff about auctions here. I am hopeful that we have a bunch of people out there watching right now who have never done auctions before and are like, this is amazing. It's so much more interesting. There's so much more strategy. I'm going to do an auction league this year. What's the one thing they need to take away from this so they can get ready to go do their first auction?
I think the only thing I'm going to say is what we just said. Spend money on guys you like, and you're going to like your team, even if you run out of money 5 players early. Right? There's volatility. The projections are so hard to do this year with the lack of with the lack of data from 2020, with the lack of reliability. Buy guys you like, and then figure it out in free agency, like on the waiver wire. There's gonna be value out there.
Yeah, I think Eric, the point you made earlier about, those last 3, 4, 5 picks at a snake draft, how often do those guys make it to,
Hmm.
the All-Star break, let alone the end of the season? Sometimes they don't even make it to May still on your roster. I think it's a really great point that if you overspend early and you're stuck with maybe your not top choices for those $1 guys at the end, you're probably going to churn through those guys anyways, at least some of them. And so I think that's a really good call out. Hunter, what about you? What's the one thing people need to take away as they get ready for their first auction?
Yeah, just don't put this pressure on yourself, right? Like you need to do prep, you need to think about your strategy and all this, but you can adjust and it is not a reflection of your ability as a fantasy baseball player, right? If you get in there and the plan doesn't go according to how you set it, right? Because you can always adjust and still get that value to make you a contending team, especially in auction, right? As you start to figure out how it's going. So I think that's going to help you not get involved in the bidding wars, ending up with someone you don't really want and just blowing all your money on and then being like, why did I do that? So don't put the pressure on it. There's a lot of good value. And like Eric mentioned, we have no idea what this year is going to look like, especially on the pitcher side, right? Other areas too. Get people that you feel comfortable with, look at the stats more and think, all right, I feel like this guy's good for this, good for this. At least I think I've got this covered. And then again, build it up during the year, but just don't put the pressure on yourself. It's fun. Auctions are more fun, especially if you're in a league where people. The commentary is amazing. So that always makes it even better.
Yeah,
Yeah,
crosstalk. Yeah, crosstalk's great. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's fun, and I think you do get this, everybody, because everybody gets to be in on the guys they want, because you never have a situation where like, oh, I love this guy, but someone loved them more, and so I never got a shot at them. You get a really good, interesting dynamic going of people talking about the guys they love, bidding on the guys they love. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah,
So
I think we should do a panel next year just on crosstalk and trash talk during auction drafts. Maybe that's the next part of this.
well, I think Nick's probably going to jump in here any second now, so we can ask him if he's ready for a
Hey, guys.
crosstalk, trash talk panel
What is
next
going
year.
on? Absolutely not. Okay, no positivity during it. No, of course. I mean that's part of the fun of all auction is that it's just going along. You get to have a good time with your friends and everything, and you get to have some good banter on the players that they're going for and pushing up the bids and everything like that. It's really a super fun experience. I mean, yeah, sure you get like the snipes from Snake, but really you get the guys that you want in auction. And oh man, I've certainly overpaid in my day for certain guys, but sometimes you have to. Sometimes that's how
Got to
it
do it.
works.
Sometimes you got to do it.
You know?
True.
By the way, I saw some people talking about the process. Jeff Zimmerman's book, really, really good about this. We are $5 away from giving away that book. We were at $4,245. His unlocks at $250. So please go to go.rallyup.com/PitchCon. Support what we're doing here. We're raising money for Feeding America. And yeah, we were doing 4 days of this, 46 hours of live streaming in just 4 days of all this baseball stuff. And this was a fantastic addition to that. Chad, Eric, Hunter, really well done job here, if I can say words. And I think a lot of people are going to be referencing this one a lot because this was a super big help to everyone in their auction leagues. I will say, though, snake drafts are still better. I'm sorry.
No way. No way.
What? I mean, I got to know my audience
versus
clearly.
chess.
No,
checkers and chess.
There's a flow to a snake draft. There's an understanding. There's a comfort to it. I guess it's like the comfort food to like the actual 5-star restaurant. Something like that.
That works too.
So you like
5-star
you like
restaurant.
scripted dance. You're not just jumping out there and just doing whatever. You want this waltz. You want this thing that you know what's going to happen.
You want this like flow, like cool. This is my understanding of what my targets are. You get that, and then auction, everything just goes boom, explosion, chaos, in no time flat. It's just crazy. And there's something comforting. I want that comfort food a little bit. Okay, let me have it. Don't make me feel bad for doing that. All right.
You just need a little bit of both. Just a little bit of both.
Sure, have both.
There you go. A little mixture, right? But really, Chad Young, Eric Dadmun, Hunter Denson, thank you guys so much. You can find all their work at Pitcherless. Some, of course, outside of that as well. But I feel really lucky to have all three of you on the staff here. And I think everybody sees like, oh, yeah, of course Pitcherless has these guys because they're fantastic. So thank you so much for being a part of it. And I'll talk to you guys soon.